So full disclosure, I asked Al Levine to be on my committee to keep me in check with the nutrition stuff. So it's really beneficial to, like he said, talk across boundaries and make sure that we're talking to each other and not past each other. So I'm going to talk about quantifying the environmental impacts of different diet preferences. And at first, I'm going to start talking a little bit about the global food system, which is important and interesting, but it's also really important to talk about dietary guidelines here in the US and the environmental impacts that they have. We'll also talk about a food subsidy program that's subsidizing healthy foods and how that's impacting the environment. That's work with Derek Yock at Vitality. So our lab has these awesome data of many crops in the world. We use a combination of census and satellite data to determine the yields and distributions of over 170 crops in the world. And these are the yields of 40 major crops globally. And this is typically how we think about agricultural productivity, right, in terms of tons per hectare. But recently, John Foley's lab at the University of Minnesota, the lab that I'm a part of, has been investigating, well, how do we translate agricultural productivity in a way that is actually meaningful to humans, in a way that means food, calories, and protein. So in 2011, we published a paper looking at global crop allocations. This map shows places in the world where we dedicate much of our crop production to food in the red, and the blue areas show areas in the world where we're dedicating much of our crop production to animal feed and increasingly biofuels. So if we look at global crop allocations, we can try to figure out how to translate yield into actual food delivery to humans. So on a global basis, 36% of all calories that we produce are used for animal feed. So we can look at global distribution of the calories produced from 40 major crops. Areas in the red show places in the world where we produce a lot of calories. And we can look at that calorie production and look at global crop allocations and try to determine what fraction of all of the calories that we grow actually ends up as food for human consumption. So food calories people can eat directly, but feed calories have to be converted into meat and dairy that is consumable for humans before they're delivered to people. And this is not a controversial fact that the conversion efficiency of grain to livestock is roughly 10%. So of all of the calories that we feed livestock, we're getting 10% back in terms of either meat or dairy. But this conversion efficiency differs a lot by the kind of livestock that you're feeding grain. So dairy and eggs and chicken are more efficient than pork and beef cattle. Beef cattle is interesting because about only 40% of its total live weight is edible boneless beef. And so you have to factor that into your conversions when you're trying to figure them out. So for every 100 calories that you feed beef cattle, you're only getting, on average, about 3% of those back. And these differ slightly. I have a little bit of a sensitivity analysis in this paper that I just submitted. So factoring in global calorie production, allocation, and conversion to animal products, we can try to figure out what proportion of the calories that we grow globally actually end up delivered to people as food. So this map shows areas in the world where a high proportion of calories produced actually get delivered to the food system, but as you'll notice that those areas are typically less productive. But places in the Midwest, in the red areas, like the red areas in the Midwest, a small fraction of the calories that we produce actually end up delivered as food because they have to get converted to meat and dairy before they get delivered to humans. So on a global basis, about 59% of all of the calories that we produce are delivered to the food system. So that 41% of the calories that is lost to the food system is mostly lost due to animal conversions to meat and dairy, but also increasingly to biofuels. So let's look at the US, because it's very important to talk about the US food system when we're at the national academies. So we can look at crop allocations in the US. The red areas are showing where we direct a lot of our calories to animals, and so those delivery fractions are small. On average, in the US, we direct about 67% of the calories that we produce to animals. It's important to note that a lot of those feed crops are consumed here in the US, but that probably 10 to 20% of those feed calories are also exported to other countries, and they're used as feed there as well. So out of all of the calories that we produce in the US, only 34% of those actually become food, which is an interesting statistic. So this is not very surprising when we consider the fact that in the US, we have a higher per capita meat consumption than almost any other country in the world. We consume, on average, about 123 kilograms per capita of meat per year. So what's recommended? I'm in a room full of people who know a lot more about this than I do, but we can look at sort of recommendations. A general average recommendation that I pulled from Institute of Medicine publication is that about 0.6 grams of protein are recommended per kilogram body weight. So if we assume a 200-pound person is about 90 kilograms, that's about 63 grams per day or 23 kilograms per year. So that's my estimate of what is nutritionally recommended for meat consumption or protein consumption. So where is that on this graph? It's down there. A lot of developed countries consume a lot more meat than is nutritionally recommended, although that's certainly not the case everywhere in the world. So I'm going to go with the nutritional recommendation for 23 kilograms per person per year. So as we've been talking about, it's no surprise to you that meat consumption has high environmental impact. So let's talk about the US typical diet and try to figure out what environmental impacts a typical US diet has, and also how shifts in diet can have environmental implications. So I'm going to talk about environmental metrics for different diets in terms of land, water, and greenhouse gas emissions. For the land requirements, I used the data that I previously mentioned of crop distribution and yields that use both census and satellite data to determine the yields and distributions of many crops globally, but I focused here on the US to figure out the land requirements of a typical US diet. But it's important to note that you have to figure out different footprints for vegetal or animal products. So for vegetable products like fruits, vegetables, cereals, you can look at their yields and figure out their land, water, and greenhouse gas footprints. But for animals, you need to figure out not only what they're eating, but how it's converted into meat and dairy. So for the animal conversion feed compositions, I use Bauman et al. Feed compositions, but USDA feed conversions. So once we figure out the yields of various crops and their conversion to animal products, we can figure out the land footprints of 100 grams of a food product. So you'll notice that I separated out these food groups into major food groups that the FAO also lumps different food commodities into these groups. And as you'll notice, beef requires a lot more land than pork, chicken, egg, etc. And for water footprints, I looked to the literature. Hoekstra et al. Has this amazing database of water footprints for crops and animal products, and they have US-specific numbers in this publication. Greenhouse gas emissions is tricky. In In order to figure out the greenhouse gas emissions for various products, we need to look at various sources of those greenhouse gas emissions. According to a recent publication, agriculture accounts for roughly 19 to 29% of global anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. But the previous speaker raised an interesting point that a lot of those emissions are in the developing world, and that's true that a lot of these emissions from agriculture are from land use change that isn't happening in the US. But overall, when we look at agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, about 80 to 86% of those emissions happen during the production stage. So that's greenhouse gas emissions that occur from fertilization or enteric fermentation. Other stages would be post-production, transportation, pre-production. So most of the greenhouse gases that I'm talking about happen during this production stage. So we also have these data that were published by Mueller et al. In Nature in 2012, looking at the amount of nitrogen applied per ton of crop. And we did this globally, but we're looking at US-specific numbers. So from this, we can figure out the nitrous oxide emissions of various crops per ton or per kilogram of production. So according to an assessment by the IPCC, about 1% of the nitrogen that we apply to fields is emitted as nitrous oxides. But nitrous oxide are a major source of greenhouse gases because they're about 310 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So we translate then these greenhouse gas emissions into CO2 equivalent emissions. But we also have to take into account enteric fermentation when we're talking about animal products. And as Mr. Mittlohner said before, that this can account for a big proportion of animal greenhouse gas emissions, and the FAO has US-specific and country-specific methane emissions per head of beef cattle and dairy cattle, and from that you can derive US-specific emissions per 100 grams of beef or per 100 grams of dairy. So methane, again, is another important greenhouse gas emission because it's 21 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So greenhouse gas emissions not accounted for here in the study that I'm about to show the results of is land use change. And this is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions globally. This figure shows the deforestation that happened in Brazil between 1992 and 2008. And these land use change greenhouse gases are quite major, but it's hard to tease out their per commodity and per production attribution for these greenhouse gases. So that's something that I left out in this part, but it's something that we'd probably need to address in further studies. So if we look at greenhouse gas emissions per 100 grams of product produced, we can see that beef has 10 times the greenhouse gas emissions than any other agricultural product. 85% of those emissions are for beef are enteric methane emissions, and 15% of those emissions are coming from feed production for beef. So we can then use these data of land, water, and greenhouse gas footprints per 100 grams of product to look at what's a typical US diet. According to FAO stat, this is what a typical US diet looks like in terms of weight. So this is the proportional makeup of a US diet in terms of the grams that we consume in the year 2008. So dairy makes up 30%. Total meat, which includes beef, poultry, and pork, is 15%, fruits and vegetables 14%, and lesser proportions of the other commodities. But when we look at the total makeup of the land requirements for this typical US diet, although meat only accounts for 15% of a US diet, it accounts for 44% of the land requirements. And although beef only accounts for 5% of the weight of a typical US diet, it accounts for 26% of the land requirements. Same story with water. Meat accounts for almost half of the water footprint of a typical US diet, and beef has a disproportionately large proportion of that. Greenhouse gas emissions. Beef accounts for 56% of the typical US diet greenhouse gas emissions, and meat overall accounts for over half of the greenhouse gas emissions of a typical US diet. So how can we develop guidelines, or how do USDA guidelines of how much meat we should be eating, how can they impact environmental footprints? As I mentioned before, the US consumes a lot of meat, more than is nutritionally recommended. So if we, just rough estimate, try to figure out how eating a USDA recommended diet has environmental benefits, we can look at, well, what if we reduced meat consumption by 75% to 30 kilograms, and the rest of that weight is supplemented by fruits and vegetables, cereals, et cetera. I'm not suggesting that we reduce total food consumption, but that we reduce meat consumption by 75% and supplement it by other things. So what we find from this is significant reductions in environmental metrics. For a quarter meat, we are saving 27% of our land footprint, 31% of our water footprint, and 46% of our greenhouse gases. If you add to that no beef consumption, it's a similar story, but with a greater decrease in greenhouse gas emissions to 59% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Interestingly, I wanted to figure out, well, what if we just kept meat consumption at 2008 levels, 123 kilograms per person per year, but we switched off of beef, towards more poultry and pork. So all the weight that we're consuming in beef, we just split it between poultry and pork. What environmental impacts would that have? Well, we're again seeing a reduction in environmental metrics, but not as much. A 15% reduction in land, 19% reduction in water, and a 52% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we're still seeing a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for the same amount of meat consumption, but just no beef. So let's talk about real-world subsidy programs, because these U.S. guidelines can have a big impact, but let's talk about efforts in reality to promote healthy eating and the environmental impact that they have. So I've been working with Derek Yock and Darren Siegel at Discovery's Vitality group, looking at their healthy food benefit. So they're subsidizing healthy food purchases for over 240,000 participants. We have data from 2009 to 2012. And we're looking at changes in the amount of, or the different kinds of foods that consumers in South Africa are purchasing when they're enrolled in this healthy food benefit subsidy program. So this is a publication that recently came out in March, showing that if you subsidize fruit and vegetable purchases do indeed go up. The black line shows non-participants in the program, where the dashed line shows participants both before they participated in the healthy food benefit program and after they participated. And so when you look at healthy food expenditures, people enrolled in the program are increasing the ratio of fruit and vegetable purchases by 5.7% to 8.5%, depending on the rate of subsidy. And they're decreasing less desirable processed, sugary, and fatty foods by 5.6% to 7.2%. So these are, so we looked at these data not in terms of purchasing dollars, but in terms of weight. So these are preliminary results from the scanner data that we have for this healthy food benefit program. The blue bar shows people before they participated, and the green bar shows people after they participated. We're seeing a decrease in the proportion of purchase weights in both beef and pork, and an increase in the purchase weights of both fruit and vegetables. And so, like a typical US diet, a South African diet has a small fraction of their diet is meat, but we're seeing some changes in the proportion of beef purchase weight, 16% decrease in the proportion of beef purchase weight, 10% decrease in the proportion of pork purchase weight, and increases in both fruit and vegetable purchases. So from this, similar to the analysis that I did for the US food system, we can look at how this change in consumption relates to a change in environmental footprint. So what we're finding is, dependent on participation, 8 to 13% decrease in land requirements, a 7 to 12 decrease in water footprint, and a 8 to 10% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. So these results show really promising results for healthy food benefit programs like SNAP that is implemented here in the US. And just for reference, concluding, the crop yield and distribution data that I showed are all freely available online, earthstat.org, which is where our lab puts our crop data. And thanks for listening. That's my Twitter handle.
Thanks, Emily. We'll have questions afterwards. We'll have time for discussion. Next, we have Christian Peters from Tufts University, who's going to speak on land use effects of various dietary patterns.